The Oval Office has always been a symbol of ultimate power, a place where global strategies are born and reshaped. On one such day, the most powerful man in the world, President Donald Trump, sat surrounded by his closest advisors, convinced he was about to bend another nation into America's orbit. His sights were set on India, a country he believed would be easy to sway. In Trump's mind, the formula was simple: offer a few lucrative defense deals, dangle some trade incentives, throw in symbolic praise, and India would follow Washington's lead like so many others had before. But what unfolded next sent shockwaves from Washington to Beijing, from Moscow to Brussels. Trump wasn't just focused on China as his great rival. India, too, was in his crosshairs. His approach, however, was rooted in old-school diplomacy, the kind of strategy that assumed America could dictate terms to developing nations and expect compliance in return. Trump believed India was still the same country that once navigated carefully between superpowers, eager not to upset anyone and always looking for approval. What he encountered instead was a transformed India, a nation that had quietly redefined itself and was ready to assert its independence in ways Washington was not prepared for. The transformation of India was embodied in its foreign minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar. Unlike the typical diplomat who cloaks every sentence in layers of jargon and ambiguity, Jaishankar was different. He spoke with calm precision, radiating quiet confidence, and displayed no interest in theatrics. His style unsettled Washington's strategists. When Trump's administration began ramping up the pressure, expecting India to panic, Jaishankar responded not with frantic appeals, but with deliberate silence. It was not the silence of weakness, but the silence of a chess master, watching the board with patience, while the opponent celebrated a move that was far from decisive. Trump's pressure campaign followed a familiar script. The United States revoked India's generalized system of preferences benefits, stripping away special trade privileges that developing nations valued. Tariffs were threatened, restrictions on oil imports from Iran were demanded, and Washington raised alarms over India's purchase of the Russian S-400 missile defense system. Each step carried the same message: fall in line with America's vision of the world or face consequences. This strategy had worked before. Countries across the globe, when faced with the loss of American privileges or markets, had eventually bent under pressure. Trump believed India would do the same. But this time, something different happened. Instead of rushing to Washington with concessions, India stood firm. Instead of begging for waivers and adjustments, New Delhi remained silent, measured, and unshaken. Then came the pivotal moment, one that changed the way the world viewed India. At a press conference that seemed routine, Jaishankar was asked how India planned to respond to America's pressure. His answer was a single word: reciprocity. To casual listeners, the word sounded ordinary. But for those paying attention, it was a thunderclap. Reciprocity was not just a diplomatic term. It was a declaration of sovereignty, a signal that the era of one-sided relationships was over. The meaning was unmistakable. If the United States raised tariffs on Indian goods, India would raise tariffs on American goods. If Washington blocked Indian technology firms, New Delhi would block American firms. If America attempted to dictate India's foreign policy, India would respond by reminding Washington that it was a sovereign nation with its own interests and its own path. Trump, who prided himself on being a master deal-maker, had not expected this. He walked into negotiations assuming that America would dictate the terms, while India would play the role of a grateful recipient. Instead, he found himself facing a nation that calmly informed him the rules had changed. Reciprocity was not spoken with anger or defiance, but with quiet certainty, and that quietness carried more weight than any loud declaration could. The shockwave was immediate. If India could resist American pressure without collapsing, without begging for relief, and without compromising its independence, what did that mean for the global balance of power? Other nations were watching, and they began to ask themselves whether they too could stand firm against Washington. India had just rewritten the playbook of modern diplomacy. Trump's frustration grew as India continued to respond with calm defiance. When pressured to end oil imports from Iran, India made it clear that its decisions would be based on its national interest, not Washington's instructions. When the United States floated the idea of mediating in the Kashmir dispute, India rejected the suggestion outright, stating that there was no role for third-party mediation, period. Each response followed the same pattern: no drama, no unnecessary confrontation, just a steady assertion of sovereignty. It was diplomacy that resembled martial arts, using the opponent's weight against them, avoiding open conflict while never yielding ground. The flaw in Trump's strategy became obvious. The entire American approach was built on outdated assumptions, on the belief that India still sought approval, that it could be pressured into concessions, that its autonomy could be traded for access to American power. What Washington failed to recognize was that India had been building its own center of gravity for decades. India was not seeking alignment. It was seeking respect. Alignment implied subordination. Respect implied equality. Trump loved to sell weapons, tanks, aircraft, and missile systems. India did buy some, but with every purchase, it also invested heavily in building its own defense capabilities. While American defense executives imagined India as a long-term client, India was developing hypersonic missiles, anti-satellite weapons, advanced drones, and even aircraft carriers of its own. India was no longer simply a buyer. It was emerging as a competitor. This evolution went far beyond defense. India's entire approach to international relations was being redefined. The old model of non-alignment, where India tried to remain neutral between superpowers, had given way to a new model of multi-alignment. India would engage with every nation, but always on its own terms. It would maintain its historical partnership with Russia while deepening ties with the United States. It would buy oil from Iran while strengthening its friendship with Israel. It would expand trade with China while standing firm against Chinese aggression at the border. To outsiders, this strategy sometimes looked inconsistent or opportunistic. In reality, it was laser-focused on a single principle: India first. This principle became especially clear in the Quad Partnership, the strategic dialogue between the United States, India, Japan, and Australia. Washington saw the Quad as a tool to contain China, an alliance that would draw India firmly into America's rivalry with Beijing. But India made it clear from the start that its participation was guided by its own vision of the Indo-Pacific, not by Washington's containment strategies. Even when Chinese troops escalated tensions on the Himalayan border, India did not rush to Washington for military guarantees. It handled the crisis independently, showing the world that strategic partnerships could coexist with strategic autonomy. The ripple effects of India's approach were global. Countries across Asia, Africa, and even Europe began to study India's model. Could they too build relationships with multiple powers without surrendering sovereignty? Could they say no to superpowers and still survive? India proved that it was possible, but it required confidence, patience, and the willingness to build independent options. Trump's disappointment was unmistakable. He expected India to be grateful for American attention, eager for American approval, and willing to sacrifice independence for friendship. Instead, he encountered a nation that treated the United States as one important partner among many, not as the center of the universe. The psychological shift was profound. For decades, American policymakers believed that every country secretly wanted to be closer to Washington. That American approval was the ultimate prize. India shattered this illusion, not by rejecting America, but by calmly insisting on equality. This transformation extended far beyond foreign policy. In technology, India built its own digital infrastructure rather than relying solely on American or Chinese systems. In space exploration, India developed cost-effective missions that challenged established players. In pharmaceuticals, it became a global supplier instead of merely a market for Western companies. Everywhere, the story was the same. India was moving from being a rule-taker to being a rule-maker, from being a market to being a competitor, from being a junior partner to being an equal stakeholder. At the heart of this transformation was the philosophy of reciprocity. What began as a single word in a press conference grew into a diplomatic doctrine and ultimately into a philosophy of international engagement. Reciprocity meant equality, mutual respect, and the rejection of one-sided relationships. It signaled that India was ready to deal with all nations, but only on terms that honored its sovereignty. The long-term impact of this shift is still unfolding. Even after Trump left office, subsequent American administrations have had to accept the new reality. India will not be anyone's junior partner regardless of who sits in the White House or what incentives are offered. More importantly, India's example has inspired other nations to rethink their strategies. The old binary of West versus non-West, alignment versus non-alignment, dependence versus isolation has given way to more nuanced approaches focused on national interest above all else. Perhaps the greatest achievement of this new Indian strategy is not just in how it reshaped U.S.-India relations, but in how it redefined global diplomacy itself. Jaishankar and his team did not rely on fiery speeches or dramatic gestures. They relied on patience, clarity, and the steady assertion of sovereignty. They showed that true strength is not about shouting the loudest, but about standing firm in silence when it matters most. And so what began with one word, reciprocity, has grown into a philosophy that is reshaping the international system. It is a reminder that in the interconnected world of the 21st century, the smartest strategy is not to pick sides, but to build bridges. It is about protecting national interest while engaging with the world, about insisting on respect while offering respect in return. India has not just repositioned itself on the global stage, it has rewritten the rules of the game.